Hey everyone, this is Reno with Neo, and this is the OPPO Find X3 Neo. So we already reviewed the OPPO Find X3 Pro on Neo, but I believe this one is an interesting device in its own right. So the first thing is that this one is actually called the Reno5 Pro Plus in China. So they rebranded it. It was a part of the Reno series in China. Here it's part of the Find series, and it's a more affordable flagship, I would say. So in terms of the specs, we got a Snapdragon 865, 12 gigabytes of RAM, and 256 gigabytes of storage. And it's pretty weird to see now this is coming out in 2021, April 2021, and it's only got a Snapdragon 865 and not the 888. But in China, this came out in November or December last year, so that makes a little more sense. And for being a more affordable variant of the phone, I think it just kind of makes sense for it to have a slightly weaker processor that you're really not gonna miss out a lot on because it is still a flagship processor, and almost every flagship these days is more than fast enough for your needs. So this is probably fine. So let's unbox this phone. And first things first, Oppo sent me this thing in the Oppo Find X3 Pro box. So, I might not have the Find X3 Pro, but I have two cases for it, so, almost the same thing. But getting to the box of the phone itself, first we have this little case, this little box, where there's a case for the right phone this time. And then under that, there's the phone itself. We'll get to that in a bit. And then under the phone, we have a charging brick, which is a 65-watt charging brick with Super VOOC charging. We have the charging cable, and under that, we even have some wired headphones, or earbuds, we should say, which of course are using USB Type-C, not a 3.5mm headphone jack. So now let's look at the phone itself, and good lord is it beautiful. So Oppo has this thing they call OPPO Glow, which is basically the design choice, is a design element that they have, where it feels like there's microcrystals on the back of the phone. And they've done that for a while with a lot of their phones, mostly the Reno ones. I believe that is actually used to be called Reno Glow. But they've done that a few times. If you've seen my Reno 4 Pro 5G, that also had that sort of microcrystal finish on the back. But this one is so much cooler because it reflects light in this weird, crazy way. There's all these different colors going on depending on how you look at the phone and the angle relative to the light. It's crazy and it just looks so nice. And it feels really nice to the touch too. It's just a really, really cool feeling phone. And it might be one of the most beautiful phones I've seen because of it. So that's really, really cool. If you do prefer more subdued style, there is a black model, but this silver one for me is just absolutely incredible. So on the back here, we also have a pretty big camera bump, which is pretty interesting too, I would say. So it's using the same IMX766 sensor as the Find X3 Pro. So the main sensor is the same. It's a 50 megapixel sensor from Sony, and it should get you some pretty good pictures. The Find X3 Pro is a pretty good phone for pictures as well, so that's a good start. But then the rest is a bit of a downgrade from that phone. So you get a 16 megapixel ultra wide camera, you get a 13 megapixel telephoto camera with 5x hybrid zoom, which isn't amazing, but it's fine. And we get the usual 2 megapixel micro camera that tends to be useless in these phones. I don't know why they didn't just put a better ultra wide in this phone. I wish they had done that instead, but well, that's what we're stuck with. There's also a color temperature sensor on the back of the phone, so that should help like even out the colors when you're taking pictures, so it can detect if it's a more yellow light or a wider light, and it can kind of help balance out the colors in the picture, and at least that's the goal. So that's an interesting sensor to have there as well. And of course you have the dual LED flash, which should be useful in certain nighttime situations. It's not something that you really want to use all the time, surprisingly. So going around the sides of the phone, this is pretty much standard for Oppo phones. So you got a volume rocker on the left, which are separate buttons. On the right, we have the power button with a little green accent, which is also very characteristic of OPPO. Nothing out of the ordinary there. But then we move on to the top edge, and that is a little weird because it looks like OPPO is using this weird sort of, not really weird, but it's just like a plastic cover instead of just using a completely metal frame. There's this plastic cover on the top that is also sort of colored. It kind of reflects pink and blue light. And it looks cool, but I'm not sure why it's there. I assume it can probably help um, with the reception of Wi-Fi and cellular networks, so maybe that's the reason why they went with that. And then on the bottom, there's also another sort of change for OPPO, which is much like the top in this case. It's completely flat. So OPPO has done this thing for a while with their phones where the top and bottom edges curve inward into the phone. And they've done that a lot with the Reno, the Find X3 Pro did the same thing. But now they got this completely flat design that's very reminiscent to me of the Galaxy Note 20 Ultra. So that's a bit of a change. But aside from that, it's pretty much the same. You got a USB Type-C port, a speaker firing down, and a SIM card slot down there, along with a microphone, of course. Overall, though, I really like the design of the phone. Of course, the back is plastic, so that's kind of not super premium in some people's eyes anyways. But I really like the way it looks. The camera module has this sort of premium feeling to it when you look at it. And it's, it's still a metal frame, it still looks pretty nice. So I do like how the phone looks. Then on the front we have a 6.5-inch Full HD Plus AMOLED display. It's got a 90Hz refresh rate, the full resolution is 2400 by 1080, so it's got a pretty tall aspect ratio. I believe that's probably 20.5 by 9, or maybe 21 by 9, that might be it. It supports HDR10 Plus and it's certified for HDR and HD video, both on Amazon Prime Video and Netflix, so if you want to stream on those with that kind of quality, that should be just fine. One thing I've noticed with this phone is that when you're watching or when you're scrolling down lists or something it's got pure black, you'll notice that there's a weird sort of dragging effect when you're scrolling, where it looks like the screen isn't updating fast enough to keep up with the blacks moving. And I think that's probably a software problem. I think software update could help that, but it does look pretty weird, so hopefully that'll be fixed with an update. And of course, at the top of the screen in the corner, you have a 32 megapixel selfie camera, which is also pretty decent. There's night mode for it. It's a pretty capable selfie camera, I would say, but of course you'll have to test it out to know for sure. In terms of the software, it's running pretty much the same stuff as the Find X3 Pro, so it's running ColorOS 11 on top of Android 11, and I really like ColorOS. It's something that I like saying, and OPPO is probably the first company whose Android skin I really enjoyed, but ColorOS 11 is even better. I really like how many customization options you get with it. There's 3 different dark modes, which is something I don't think anyone else is offering, so you can choose how dark you want dark mode to be. And then there's this suite of customization options. You can change the shape of the quick actions in the action center, and you can change the system colors, which affects the quick actions as well, but then also the settings app, and even the highlights in things like the phone app and the calculator app. So every system app is affected by that color change, and I think it's really cool that you can do that. So I'm a pretty big fan of ColorOS 11, I gotta say. And I briefly mentioned the camera app there for a second, but one of my favorite things about the camera app is night mode for video. So I saw this for the first time on the TCL Plex at the end of 2019, and that phone had a dedicated camera for night mode video. But here it's just a software toggle, so you enable it, and it applies to your main camera or to your selfie camera as well. I think that's new actually. And it's just underappreciated because all these phones have night mode for pictures, but I feel like having it for video is also so cool and also very useful. So I'm really glad that OPPO is still investing in that, and I hope they keep doing it because it's just a really cool thing to have. But that's pretty much it in terms of first impressions of the Find X3 Neo from OPPO. One last thing to mention is that it is a phone that costs 819 euros, so it's not exactly cheap. It's still pretty much flagship territory. It is a little cheaper than something like the Galaxy S21, but it's not super cheap. It has advantages and disadvantages there in terms of the specs. But yeah, that's still a pretty high price for something with last year's processor. But anyways, we'll be reviewing the phone in its entirety over the next few weeks. Usually I'd say 2 weeks, but I'm actually going to have my review period interrupted by something that I think is really, really cool. It's my first foldable, so stay tuned for that. I'm trying to make a video about it as well and write about it on neowin.net. And then after that, of course, I will have my review of the Find X3 Neo on neowin.net as well. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.